Welcome to the C. Warren Goldring Lecture on Canada-U.S. Relations. My name is David Biette, and I'm the Director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to hear our trailblazing and prestigious speaker, William Reilly. The Goldring Lecture was founded earlier this decade by Warren Goldring as a joint venture between the Woodrow Wilson Centre's Canada Institute and the Toronto-based Canada Institute on North American Issues. Warren passed away earlier this year and is greatly missed. Warren's initial gift to the Canada Institute brought our work to life, and I'm grateful for his support and guidance he offered through the years. It's an honor for me to introduce Warren's son, Blake, who will introduce our speaker. It's been a tremendous pleasure for me to work with Blake and his sister Judy on this lecture as well as other events. I'd like to say a quick word about the Canada Institute before formally introducing Blake. The Canada Institute is an integral program of the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars, the living national memorial to the 28th President established by the United States Congress in 1968 within the Smithsonian Institution. It is a nonpartisan institution supported by public and private funds engaged in the study of national and world affairs. The Centre establishes and maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. It does not have a research or legislative agenda. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and Canada-U.S. issues among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. We accomplish this goal by providing stakeholders from both sides of the border, including members of the public, private, academic, and not-for-profit sectors, with the opportunity to voice their opinion, concerns, and ideas on bilateral issues in a nonpartisan, open forum. And now let me briefly introduce Blake Goldring. Blake is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer and a member of the Board of Directors of AGF Management Limited. He has led the growth of AGF's business, which today manages more than $44 billion in assets. In addition to his work with AGF and the financial community, Blake is actively involved in many other business, civic, and charitable organizations. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the C.D. Howe Institute, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and the World Presidents Organization. He also serves as a director of the Canadian Film Centre and was formerly director of World Wildlife Canada. Blake is chairman of Canada Company, an apolitical organization created in 2006 to bring community leaders across Canada together to support Canadian soldiers in the work they do at home and abroad. And now, please welcome Blake.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. I must say it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning, and I think you're going to be really impressed by our speaker. I've had the pleasure, Bill, of getting to know you over breakfast, and certainly a very impressive background that you have, so I know we're going to be very interested to hear the message. This lecture series bears the name of my father, who passed away earlier this year. He was always interested in public policy and questions about Canadians. Who are we? And wanting to get a better understanding and creating a dialogue to try to better inform and better get an idea of how we can create better policies and a greater understanding among peoples, and particularly with our great neighbors to the south. Now, public policy is a very interesting topic, and one which certainly in the last year has been dominated by the world economy trying to get things moving again. But underlying everything, of course, and not far off to the side, has been really two twin very important issues. One, energy, and the other, dealing with the environment. Certainly here in Canada, it's been very timely for us as we've gone and considered the issues of our oil sands and the prosperity they bring, but at the same time balancing that against environmental issues. Now, just by coincidence, I don't know if anybody saw in the Globe, but I thought it couldn't be better placed. So I don't know, David, you must have some very powerful strings to get this article, but those of you who didn't see it, are the oil sands in crosshairs of Obama plan. Now, these are the sorts of issues that are of huge concern to Canadians as we start to look into the future. I can't think of a better person to really address exactly that type of issue. I've got to introduce the Honourable William H. Reilly, a former administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is the EPA, and spent most of his adult life working in exactly these two sectors, energy and the environment. Bill's a Harvard Law graduate with a vast and diversified background and keen interest in environmental issues. Bill was the administrator of the EPA between 1989 and 1993. He's been referred to in some circles as the first professional environmentalist, which I think is a title that would make me very proud. I'm sure you must enjoy that one. Under his watch, the U.S. signed into law the first clean air bill designed to cut sulfur dioxide pollution in half. Under Bill's leadership, the EPA participated in NAFTA and GATT trade negotiations to ensure the environment was considered during these talks. He also headed the U.S. delegation to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro and was prominent there in advancing forest conservation on an international scale. In addition to his groundbreaking work within the U.S. administration, Bill has devoted considerable time, energy, and effort in working with leading nonprofit organizations. As was just mentioned, he's been a long member of WWF, and he is the chairman emeritus in the United States. And again, I've been honored to serve 7 years. I should say that AGF, my father created a relationship with WWF back in 1982, and it was a part of the Preservation of the Endangered Species program, and we still are a proud sponsor of that here in Canada. He's a great friend of Climate Works Foundation, where he's got the role of chairman. He's got involved in International Philanthropic Network, and other noteworthy credentials include co-chair of the U.S. National Commission on Energy Policy and chairman of the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University of Northern Carolina. We're extremely fortunate to have Bill with us today, and he's going to share with us his thoughts and insights about common energy future and what it means to neighborly relations. It's a great honor now. I pass the podium over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Blake, for that very nice introduction. Judy, David, Liz, my several friends I have met for the first time in many years here this morning. Very pleased to deliver this prestigious lecture, and particularly to have looked a little bit at the biography of Warden Goldring and see the WWF connection. Obviously, that's one that's close to my heart, and I was just explaining to Blake that I regretted that when WWF recently made a trip to Cuba, I couldn't tag along for reasons that might not be understood here in this country. I haven't yet managed to get there. I also want to say something about Senator Moynihan, who is regarded as one of the fathers of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I hadn't realized that until last evening when David Biet told me. He was a great man. I worked closely with him, and he was very good on issues of science and science policy. And I recall once testifying in front of Senator Moynihan, and we were testifying about risk. And he said, "You are right, Mr. Reilly, to focus upon risk and risk reduction as the principal metric of regulatory success. But I caution you," and he was a kind of an eccentric speaker, "I caution you, looking over these half glasses at me, not to judge the necessity to get to zero risk, because you need to remember that, well, life is about risk, and it ends badly." Now, believe me, I never have had a U.S. Senator speak like that. So no notes or anything else. Moynihan, he also famously disparaged a welfare reform program that was going to hire a lot of social workers once by saying, "Isn't that like feeding the birds by feeding the horses?" Anyway, this was an unusual man. I have had a long and mostly happy relationship with Canada. I used to come here as the chief sponsor of the Clean Air Act, the sulfur dioxides reduction program that was so important to Canada and had been advised early on that when I was alone with the President, I was advised by someone very close to him, and I was trying to get his support for a 10 million ton bill. He said, play the Canadian card. He said, President Bush feels very strongly that Prime Minister Mulroney and Canada were promised action on acid rain in the Reagan administration that was never delivered. And he will be very sympathetic to your pressing that case. Later, when we had finally succeeded in getting the bill passed through the Congress, the Chief of Staff, the Vice President, and the Budget Director, to my astonishment, all were recommending veto. And I had an understanding with your ambassador to the United States, Derek Burney, that the moment the bill passed, he would alert Prime Minister Mulroney, who would call President Bush and say, you will go down in history, Mr. President, as the greatest American friend Canada ever had. He did that, and there were no further discussions about veto. I once had a less happy exchange here with Jean Charest, and I used to come and do the Great Lakes Commission reviews together, and we were in Upper Michigan, and Greenpeace organized a very strenuous opposition to us, but the most interesting part of it was suspended from the very high floor of an apartment building was a huge sign that it said, Charest, Reilly, assassin. And John also was amused about that sign, and we tried to go up and have our photograph taken with it, but the Greenpeace people wouldn't believe that we meant no harm to their sign and their protest. We did a lot of good things together, and all of it, I think, bespeaking that we two countries share certainly an environment, a culture. It doesn't seem so, or it hasn't seemed that we shared a political culture for the last, or two of the last three elections, but I think the more recent one we did. At least one common language, and a good bit of water, which I know is an issue in this part of the world. I recall having had a number of conversations at the time about climate change, and Prime Minister Mulroney once cautioning me that you would not want to put global warming to a plebiscite in Canada in February. It would carry too heavily. Well, I have had three careers, as Blake mentioned. A long nonprofit career with World Wildlife Fund, a government career and in the White House in the early 70s, and then later at Environmental Protection Agency, and then in private sector work in finance since 1994 with Texas Pacific Group, TPG Capital, a large private equity, international private equity firm based in Fort Worth, Texas, but most of us actually hang out in San Francisco. And I'm going to start by discussing a deal that we struck that I think is relevant to one's perspective on the private sector and its role and responsibility for leading in a new green era, and what that means for the various obstacles we confront in trying to pass carbon control legislation in the United States and get an international agreement with developing countries as well as Europe and the rest of the world in Copenhagen in December. I was asked in the fall of 2007 by David Bonderman, the founder of TPG, if I would consider trying to smooth the way to the acquisition of the largest public utility, electric power utility in Texas, Texas Utilities, which had 37% market share. And that if I would take some soundings on how it was regarded generally in the world that I am familiar with, and whether or not there was any way that we could acquire it. I made a telephone call to David Hawkins at the Natural Resources Defense Council without telling him why I was calling, and asked him just to give me a little bit of a briefing about the state of play with respect to coal. You may know that the United States depends for its electricity on coal. About 50% of electricity is generated by coal power in the United States. Well, at that time, Texas Utilities had committed to build 8 new coal-fired power plants in Texas, in addition to those it already had. I think it had 5, and 3 in other states where electricity was deregulated in the United States. So as I got Hawkins on the phone, he said, if you really want to understand how bad it can get, look at the Auschwitz of the carbon wars, and that's Texas utilities. I told my partner, I said, I think this may be harder than you thought. At any rate, the long and the short of it was, I engaged in a 90-day review of the growth prospects for the company and for Texas. Texas is the largest, fastest growing electricity generating demand state in the United States at 2.3% then. It's slowed down significantly since. And essentially made a number of, or prepared the buyers to make a number of concessions and commitments. The commitments included to make Texas Utilities the largest buyer of wind power in the state, 1,500 megawatts, to commit it not to build any more coal-fired power plants except 3 that were currently under construction, unless they were absolutely carbon capture and sequestration ready, to spend $400 million on demand-side management. Essentially, a lot of that's being spent on meters to control communications back and forth between the user and the company, to regulate, particularly in areas of high ozone alerts, the use of energy by turning off the air conditioner for 10 minutes, for example, and to cancel 8 of those coal-fired power plants and the 3 that were planned for the deregulated states, just simply to promise not to build them. Later conducted a negotiation to do that with the Environmental Defense Fund and Natural Resources Defense Council, and reached an agreement with them that this was considered a good deal. And you may imagine that to negotiate something of this sort with non-governmental organizations was not exactly business as usual for KKR and TPG investors. And the first response to my suggestion that we do it that way was to say, well, suppose we alert them a couple of hours before the announcement. And in going to Fred Krupp, was the individual that I dealt with at Environmental Defense Fund, I remember he asked me to talk to somebody in Texas who I didn't know, and I did know all the other players very well. And I remember saying, you know, this has got to be a deal that if it is not acceptable to you, you don't discuss. You keep the secret, because it's tens of millions of dollars have been spent already on preparing for this purchase, this bid. And it's a $45 billion deal. It's the largest private equity deal ever done. Well, the long and the short of it is we did reach an agreement. We settled on that proposal. And as I look back on it, many things are extraordinary. As you did the focus analysis of Texans, they were not demanding that this company become environmentally green. They were concerned about rates, and we also promised to reduce the rates. We reduced the rates 15%. They were not unhappy, those who held shares in the company. They had had a 500% share increase in the previous 6 or 7 years. It was a successful company in many respects. But it was not a company that under its present leadership was adapted, we thought, to the future. The deal that we struck was very popular in Washington, although, of course, carbon regulation was, at that time, just a dream in the minds of many. But more recently, when the Waxman-Markey bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives, one of its provisions awarded allocations to coal-fired power generators whose plants had been completed by 2008. Well, none of these 3 had been completed by 2008. And this was a matter of a $700 to $800 million net present value to the company if they were not included in the allocations. Long and the short of it is that with the support of environmentalists on the floor of the House, Congressman Markey did insert a provision including those 3 plants on the grounds that we had really tried to do that right. I think that at the time I was asked what this meant for the future, and I hesitated to say that this was a whole new era. But in fact, in finance, it really is. And I received a call from the chief financial officer of America's largest coal-fired power company after that and said, my boss says I should talk to you, find out whom we should speak to, and ask if, in the environmental community, and ask if I could come back to you and find out what they said to us, because we're probably going to need some translation because we've never talked to these people before. That was the climate then. And I think in private equity, as in so many other areas, the idea that major financial decisions would be subject to strong environmental commitments and the participation and partnership, really, with highly respected non-governmental organizations marks an important milestone. Well, in sum, I think that is but one piece of evidence that climate change and carbon regulation are blowing in the wind. Extraordinary thing to me, traveling as much as I do, is that the public is very far in the United States from clamoring for new carbon regulation. And I take some comfort from remembering that neither were the publics of Canada and the United States clamoring for the Montreal Protocol to regulate upper atmospheric ozone. Much of the leadership, in fact, to do that came from the chemical industry. And it came from the chemical industry at the moment when the industry had developed the substitutes to chlorofluorocarbons. And so my message really today is about the very important nexus between the private sector, upon whom we depend for the technologies, the innovation, the inventions that will allow us to drive into a much cleaner, carbon-free future, and the role of government, which in so many of these areas is following rather than leading. I know when I got out of law school, to work for government in the public sector was considered a great honor. And it still is by so many people, and I think with the recently, the mood in Washington at the moment, it may become so again. But the truth is that to a degree that was not true then, the leadership and the invention and the imagination and the innovation is really coming from the private sector, the new ideas. Well, the climate, of course, is more challenging than regulating or controlling the upper atmospheric ozone, and crafting an international agreement to do so, extremely challenging. I read in the Sunday New York Times recently that Bono, who had an excellent article about encouraging the United States to stay in the game with respect to the Millennium Goals, Bono said, if I can remember this, he said, national characters can be summed up. He said the British want to be respected. The Russians want to be feared. The French want to be envied. And Americans want to be loved. And I was trying to think of, well, what do Canadians want? The Canadians want Americans not to steal your water. I know that from many press conferences up here. But you're dealing with all of these countries with their own cultures, histories, and prejudices, and their own reservations about interfering in the economic development to the degree that climate regulation, carbon regulation really would entail. My own history with the climate issue was most principally in the Bush administration, where we had scientific analysis, and I used to say the vast preponderance of scientific opinion did in fact support the hypothesis that the climate was warming and that humans were contributing to it. But all we really had as evidence of that, if evidence you would consider it, were models. There has been a profound change since then in that we see much of Alaska melting away, the Himalayan glaciers under stress, sea level rising, and developments occurring that, while not attributable with conclusive scientific certainty to climate change, nevertheless are completely consistent with, in fact, exceed the predictions in severity of the models. So that's changed. We nevertheless do have naysayers, and I notice in my time they've gone through several phases. The first was to say, oh, it isn't really getting any warmer. It's not warmer in Afghanistan this year or southern Argentina. And then, well, it may be getting warmer, but humans aren't contributing to it. And then, of course, well, maybe we are, but we can't afford in the near term until we get better technologies to address it. And there's some truth to that, at least to address it successfully. And then finally, well, maybe it's getting warmer and maybe we're doing it, but it's too late. So I've heard them all. Joe Barton, who's former chairman of the House Energy Committee in Texas, was furious at us for negotiating with environmental organizations who were not his favorite people. And he said, does this mean that in the future every major deal in investment is going to have the approval of NGOs, environmental NGOs? And my answer, not to his face, was, no, sir, only in Texas. The need for leadership has been responded to, I think, by a number of companies. And I have been very impressed that a number of companies that ordinarily shy away from the public policy mud bath have engaged the climate issue. And we have seen Nike, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, Exelon, a couple of other companies withdraw from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because of the Chamber's disparagement of the science of climate change. We've also seen a number of organizations engage in a 2 to 3 year program, the United States Climate Action Partnership, that actually worked to develop and now supports climate legislation. That includes some very big and important ones like General Electric, DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, and others. And they are sitting side by side in that group with World Resources Institute, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, in crafting their own recommendations. I think that has got to be the wave of the future for a number of very important reasons that happen to be compelling at this time. One is a large distrust of government, certainly in the United States, and a distrust of Wall Street. You know, we had a great deal of difficulty convincing the environmental community and others that cap and trade for sulfur dioxides would actually work. And it has worked. The electric utility industry estimated it would cost something like $1,400 to $1,600 a ton of sulfur dioxide removal. In fact, the cost has come in at under $200. My own agency, EPA, predicted the cost would be between $600 and $800. And that was really because of the success of a market-based, incentivized program. Well, we, the United States, finally convinced the Kyoto parties to embrace cap and trade, which they did in the Kyoto Treaty. Then we chose not to ratify it. But the current mood is such that because it involves the market, because it will contribute to the creation of new financial instruments, such as derivatives, it is disparaged. So we've come full circle. In fact, the governor of New Jersey, who was renowned for his leadership of Goldman Sachs when he was elected 4 years ago, is now criticized for having been associated with Wall Street. So we see that cap and trade is under attack because of the current economic crisis, and the need, I think, for leadership on the part, particularly the financial community, to help address this problem is paramount. In sum, I think that the moment cries out for leadership. As I look at the Texas utilities deal and my experience with the private sector generally, I think there are 4 or 5 principles that I would draw that characterize our moment, and particularly the way the private sector sees itself in this moment, as follows. First of all, a license to operate is simply not granted by government anymore. Public acceptance is crucial, and there are hundreds of examples of that. Secondly, I have served since 1993 on the board of DuPont as chairman of the Environmental Policy Committee, and it's clear to me that public acceptance, which used to be conferred by scientists for a product, is not guaranteed by scientists any longer. And you can point to any number of examples of that, but many chemicals where that is the case, where PFOA, the most recent one, a catalytic agent used in making Teflon, determined with extensive epidemiological research not to cause problems for people, nevertheless, and conclude by EPA as well, is slated to be eliminated by the company itself voluntarily, simply because of the anxieties about it and the concerns that people have about it. Third, I think success in today's world requires close attentiveness to values and trends. And it requires collaboration with non-traditional partners. That is what we did in the Texas Utilities case. That is increasingly, I think, what smart companies are doing. That is what U.S. Climate Action Partnership involves. And I think it's a path to success. Fourth, dedication on the part of the private sector to reducing its environmental footprint is really essential. It is the measure of sincerity and seriousness that one can apply to a corporation. And I know DuPont is tremendously proud that it's reduced by 72% its greenhouse gases since 1993. The big anxiety there now is, how about early action credit when finally the law passes, which probably isn't in the cards, but nevertheless would have been nice to have and just. And finally, openness to the public policy process and engagement with it in a way that is not comfortable for most private sector companies, I think increasingly is important. And this certainly has proved true for the electric power industry and for Texas Utilities, for which we now Energy Future Holdings itself. We have seen some companies, and I think the private sector generally the best performers in our field, move from an emphasis on cleanup and compliance in the 80s and early 90s to waste reduction and efficiency of energy use in the 90s, and now increasingly to market-facing products. That is, those products that reduce the impact on the environment or reduce the greenhouse gas generation, carbon dioxide generation, of customers and consumers. I think one of the most interesting examples of that is DuPont pioneers development of corn seeds, which can produce corn with 110 days of frost-free weather. Ordinarily, it requires 140 degrees. So this is preparing for the day when the climate of Illinois and Iowa becomes like that of Texas today, and corn moves up into northern Canada, where it will be possible maybe to grow it near the Arctic Circle. I don't know. Corn uses a lot of water, too. Well, in sum and in conclusion, let me just say I think that we are at an inflection point. I think we have long wanted to see an intersection of our environmental aspirations with our economic goals. We have not, frankly, succeeded in the United States in doing that as well as we had hoped and expected, though we have had success with most of the priorities that we have set for environmental legislation. We see now, as Walmart is requiring that its fisheries and hardwoods be certified by the Forest Stewardship Council and the Marine Stewardship Council, and requiring that its providers, those who supply it, also comply with those rules. We're seeing as British Petroleum, ConocoPhillips, and Shell support cap-and-trade carbon regulation, oil companies. We're seeing it as the auto industry, with which I have a lot of experience, having been at EPA. One principle of running EPA successfully is never get in a fight with the auto industry and the oil industry in the same week. The auto industry has supported automobile fuel efficiency standard improvements. Now, the sun really is rising in the West. Anyway, I think that we can look forward to a day when we have a much greener economy. We can probably also look forward to a day when summer vacationers are basking in the beaches of Hudson Bay. But an adaptation is a subject for another day. We're going to have to pay much more attention to adaptation than we have. And I serve on a task force in California trying to plan for adaptation of that state as climate begins to change and the sea level begins to rise. But it is an extraordinary moment. In many ways, a very hopeful and optimistic moment. I was asked by the Chinese Environment Minister recently, what is the meaning of a bill which has passed one house of your parliament? And I said, well, I used to say when Environmental Protection Agency had failed to meet a regulated statutory milestone, but we'd made some progress, that it's directionally correct. I wondered how that was rendered into the Chinese. The Chinese, I think, are reassuring at the moment. Then China and its competitive situation has been on the minds of certainly the business leaders who are embracing climate change regulation in the United States, very concerned about the competitive threats. China has shown increasingly that it is more open to significant moves in this area than ever before, and we've seen the extraordinary subsidies that the Chinese have put into the manufacture of solar modules in the past year, reducing the cost by about $2 a kilowatt, significant cost reduction. And I think they're determined to take more of that green trade for themselves. I'm one of those people who applauds it, thinks it's going to benefit the world and certainly going to benefit China. And so I support it. So it's a new day, and it's a very satisfying one to have this extraordinarily attentive audience at 8 o'clock in the morning. I must say, that impressed me possibly more than almost anything else about this lecture. Will they really come? And you did, and you listened, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Reilly has agreed to take some questions, and we have some roving microphones. For the sound, please wait for the microphone. Bob, why don't you start, and do you call out the questions?
Yes.
Thank you, Liz Dowds. Well, Bill, I wonder if you would care to speculate on the outcome of Copenhagen.
Well, I think that Copenhagen will not see, will very unlikely see legislation passed in the United States, which many have listed as the sine qua non for a successful meeting there. Other countries want to make sure that the United States is engaged in this dialogue. It's not like Kyoto, where there was a certain feeling on the part, I think, of the Europeans that was almost that the United States isolation was, people took some pleasure in that. And there was some sense that the Europeans were determined to go it alone wherever the United States was. No one will make that mistake again. I think we're too large an emitter and too large an economic player. But I would expect that the parties will be relatively sympathetic and patient with the Obama administration. The president's made his priorities clear. Congress has, after all, passed one serious piece of legislation in the House. My understanding is that very significant progress has been made on offshore oil and gas leasing and on nuclear support, nuclear energy support, which were two key items of interest to several Republicans. And our analysis shows you have to get about 7 or 8 Republican votes to pass this bill. So I think we'll have progress to report. But what I would hope will come from Copenhagen is agreement on the structures, on the financial mechanism, on the way to monitor, on the measurement of offsets and how much they will count and what will count with respect to offsets, forest degradation, and how you'll monitor that sort of thing. And that would be a significant step forward. That would be an improvement. We have to do all of that. The architecture of climate regulation is complex and will require agreements. So I think many of those things will come out of it, and we will probably then go into a second Copenhagen II round that presumably will await the enactment of carbon legislation in the United States. So I think people will do everything to make that conference a success, short of getting an international agreement. Increasingly, my own sense is that we are not going to see anything quite like the Montreal Protocol on climate, that we're going to see a series of of individual commitments on the part of important countries to their best practices, which they will then commit to maintain, monitor, and prove in return for offsets entitlements. And I think that's particularly notable about China. The Chinese are very resistant to the idea of a cap, even though it seems to me they're going to have to embrace it one day. But they're entirely open to making commitments about specific investments in energy, whether it's wind or solar or improved coal or carbon sequestration. I mentioned the importance of the private sector. You know, one of the best practice clearly for coal is carbon sequestration, but we don't know how to do it. We are awaiting upon the development of the technology and its proof to establish it. So I think we will have progress in Copenhagen. I don't think we need be embarrassed that it will be written off as a failure, and we'll move beyond it to, I think, something more substantial within the following year. All the way back there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for hearing my question. Our countryside in Ontario was being inundated with hundreds of wind turbines. However, there's a propensity to locate them in residential areas. My discomfort is that the present government does not seem to be sympathetic to our concerns. For example, endangered wildlife species, health factors, expenses, et cetera, et cetera. How is that experience being interpreted in Texas, for example?
You know, I missed the first part of that question. It had to do with the intrusion of development into residential areas?
Yes, in Ontario, there are hundreds of wind turbines being located in residential areas. And the concerns of the citizens are well known, but our government doesn't seem to be sympathetic to any of those issues.
This is an issue that has recently come to light. Senator Alexander from Tennessee delivered a speech the other day. He talked about energy sprawl, about these things appearing on mountains and in neighbors' yards. And wind turbines are very high. And so there are zoning regulations that are enforce them. I know in California, you cannot impede the sun from reaching the solar panels of your neighbor. But wind is handled differently because of the danger of a tower falling. I've been intrigued to see that these issues just do not arise in Texas. Wind power there is welcome. It's, of course, there's a lot of space and there's a lot of wind. And that has made it relatively easy for Texas utilities to invest and get up to 1,200 megawatts of wind power, heading toward 1,500, and then to put more than $1 billion into the transmission lines to make sure that that power gets where it belongs. By and large, I would assume that wind turbines do not really belong, not the kind I'm familiar with, in residential areas. I don't think that the typical lot sizes or the configuration of the architecture really are conducive to that. But there is plenty. We both have very large countries. There are plenty of places, and in fact, at least in the United States, the problem with wind is where the wind blows is where the people are not. And so it takes a lot of investment in transmission lines to make sure that that wind gets to the public. The other problem, and here's another area for invention, is we don't have batteries which can give us the capacity to store the wind. So that I didn't understand this until a few years ago, that when you build wind power in Texas, you have to also put backup gas-fired power, because you've only got a guarantee of the wind for about 36% of the time, and 36% is actually a high number in that field. So we are desperately in need of storage capacities, some technology that will allow us to keep the wind for when we really need it, because it also doesn't always blow in the moments of high ozone alerts when you would like to turn off all of the coal-fired fossil fuel power. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Stephen Clarkson, University of Toronto. Can cap and trade be done only in the United States? If not, for North America, do Canada and Mexico have to wait until the U.S. decides what its cap and trade system is? If so, just adopting the U.S. norms may not be appropriate for the Canadian and Mexican economies? And I don't know if you can address also, can we have a cap-and-trade system without shutting down the tar sands?
Cap and trade can be done in any one country. Yes, it can. And in fact, the United States system is very likely to be somewhat incongruous or asymmetrical with the European cap and trade system. I think so far it looks like we're going to include a lot more industry and activity in our cap and trade, at least under Waxman-Markey, than they have. And I quite agree with you that the characteristics of different economies and countries will make different things important. I believe you can have cap and trade with oil sands, and the way you would do it is probably move to provide significant incentives, or maybe, well, I'll leave it at that, to steam, what's it called? Steam-activated gravity development, which is basically 90% underground to get the oil sands. And that has the advantage of dealing with the surface impacts, the water and the rest of them that have been troublesome with respect to oil sands. And it also allows you a much better chance to contain the CO2 that's associated with the production. Technologies are under development for oil sands, and I've looked at them just last week, that allow several increments of improvement with respect to a whole range of basically carbon dioxide, use of waste heat and injection of the steam. And the oil companies do know how to inject, because they've been getting enhanced oil recovery by injecting CO2 in the ground for 50 years. So the answer is yes, I think it is possible. I think there's going to have to be some more technology. It has seemed to me personally that these submarine-style nuclear reactors might be very appropriate to generate the electrical power to develop the oil sands. And my sense is that that is something that is being looked at by the industry. Yes, sir.
Tony Marcil with the Forest Stewardship Council of Canada. Do you feel that there's a future for balance sheets in our systems of national accounts as a way of dealing with external costs that are not included now?
Everybody hear that? Do I think there is a future for balance sheets in making accounts, economic accounts in our economy? And it reminds me of the World Wildlife Fund U.S. has a long relationship with Bhutan, where they have gross national happiness as their GNP equivalent. It seems to work. I've always been sympathetic to the efforts to try to adjust those accounts so that you did manage to credit homemaking and housekeeping and child care and all of these things that do not get credited, even as several non-productive areas are credited for, including a lot of pollution generation for the accounts. It's very tricky to do, I think, and I don't think you want to trivialize the whole exercise by moving too fast on it, but I'm familiar with several exercises that try to do that, and I would be very interested in seeing a system of parallel accounts as we go forward, so that we really see what are those values of the society that matter so much to ourselves, to our cultures, that have not been accounted for, and how we might begin to account for them. The problem, of course, is the metric. If putting a value, a monetary value on things, itself sometimes denigrates it, because we think of the best things in life as priceless. So it's not easy, but yes, I'm sympathetic to that, very much so. You had a question?
Yes, Richard Longley. What advice would you give to Canadian environmental engineering businesses who would like to do business with the United States in an era of Buy American, which doesn't seem to be a federal issue, anything that federal governments can address?
The Buy American impulse was very much a response to the recent crisis, economic crisis and recession in the United States. Has largely, I think, been discredited, in some cases by fear of the WTO, in other cases simply by the president intervening to say this is not consistent with the national interest, and obviously will entail retaliation. And so I don't think it's a phenomenon that over time will matter that much. I don't think it will last that long. But I am aware that it has been followed for a time, and you know, you can well imagine the politics of it when we've got an 11% unemployment rate, which we've got in California, and there's very much a desire to put the local folks to work. That's really the impulse. But I don't think, and I think particularly as we get our wits about us, we recover our confidence, which we lost a lot of in the last couple of years, and our economy begins to improve, I don't think it will be a persisting problem. I think we'll return to the kinds of respect for world trade principles that have animated at least most of our exchanges historically, with notable exceptions. Well, what's a Canadian to do? The hard thing is, in some cases, one can appeal to laws in the United States. In others, and the really protracted solution, which is not a solution at all, is to appeal to the WTO and to raise this issue. I was impressed that this issue did come up between the meeting of Prime Minister Harper and President Obama. And I think from the point of view, at least of the American administration, there's complete sympathy and understanding of the need to not to do this. Where?
The Ontario Environment Industry Association. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the issue of scientific literacy among policymakers. The companies that we represent are often in discussions with government where science is treated more as a perspective, a point of view, rather than something that has to be treated with respect and said, okay, that's the reality, how do we accommodate it? I think we've all been in enough policy discussions where they say, well, that's what the scientists have to say. Let's look at what else we have to say. I'm wondering if you could talk about efforts in the U.S.
You're talking to somebody who has a lot of sympathy on that. You know, when I deal with the climate deniers, I mean, I'm not a scientist. I used to say to the president, I mean, all we've got to go on is what scientists tell us and understand about these issues. And now we have had 11 national academies of science opine on the climate issue. 11. All over the world, and we have these demonstrated impacts on the environment. Scientific literacy is a serious problem, I think, in the United States. I think it's a problem that goes well beyond the legislators. It's the people they represent. I mean, you may have seen some of the polls about how many people accept evolution, for example, and what do you do about that? Well, I think you do raise, I did always take the approach when I was at EPA that science it is what we have. It is the secular religion in many cases, that if you don't repair to the science in setting regulatory standards, you're without a paddle. You have nothing. So I think we need to vastly increase the resources going to science and engineering education. That is happening. It's happening particularly it was a major priority at Harvard under Larry Summers, a priority under Rick Levin at Yale. It has been for 20 years now there to really significantly strengthen those elements of the curriculum. And I think one interesting thing to me was there was a time when one of our very substantial universities' physics department did not have a single American national among its advanced students, not one. What they had was Chinese. And that's certainly a worrisome thing, that students are not choosing this line of work. Science doesn't have the regard that it should have, I think, in our culture. And yet, as the basis for policy, it's what we have. So I think to deal with the legislators who are reflecting the views of people they represent, after all, I think we've got to go back to basics and really make it a much more important priority in the schools. I don't know whether that's really happening at the moment. No Child Left Behind does give a program that President George W. Bush and Senator Kennedy worked out together, does give a much greater priority to math and science, and scores have been coming up in schools on math performance in the States, and that's much to be desired. Whether that's filtering into a greater scientific sophistication remains to be seen. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have a question about the relationship between the EPA and the legislature in regards to climate regulation. I heard one legislative member say nothing moves legislation like someone else doing their job, legislator's job. So the EPA's recent reporting rule that's going to come into effect in January, how do you think that's going to help move along climate regulation? And if we don't get something, cap and trade legislation, is the EPA equipped to take on the job?
You know, I had lunch early on with the new EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, who's fabulous, who's really a star, and who is very reluctant to engage the climate issue. And I understand why. I mean, to regulate carbon is such a massive intervention in the economy. You're going to affect so much activity. And the statutes that EPA administers, particularly the Clean Air Act, have never been designed with that in mind. Nevertheless, under the Supreme Court's decision, Massachusetts v. EPA, EPA has the responsibility to make a determination about whether there is an endangerment associated with carbon dioxide. They have made that determination. They've said that, yes, there is. And they produced volumes of scientific evidence in support. And so now they have to deal with it. They absolutely have to address it. And I was exposed last week to a full briefing on EPA's authorities to do it. And it's very messy. EPA does two things. It sets standards, ambient standards, it's the air in general, and it has emission controls or standards. Well, you can imagine emission standards and get them down, but ambient standards determines whether a place is in attainment or not. If Washington's not in attainment, neither is Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or any other part of the country. So the whole country would have to be in non-attainment under one theory. Well, if the country's in non-attainment, all sorts of things are triggered. Offset requirements and restrictions on new development and new source performance standards. And at the end of the day, if you start just by regulating the new anticipated coal and gas-fired power in the United States, you can get about a 6% reduction in greenhouse gases by the year 2020, I think it is. So you really see that we've got to have comprehensive regulation. We've got to have a statute. My case to her, however, has been, well, even if you don't want to take it on, act as though you do. Because the one thing that some of the folks who are against climate regulation in the Congress really do understand is anything is better than EPA. And some have even said so. Mike Morris, the head of American Electric Power, in his statement of support for legislation in the Congress, he has a lot of problems with the existing legislation. He wants some improvements. But he said in the third paragraph, if we don't get this, EPA is going to regulate us, and nothing could be worse. Well, that's a time when I always like the 800-pound gorilla and the reputation EPA has for aggressiveness. But the answer, my view of it is not an efficient way to address the problem. The statutes that, as they exist, do not make that easy or even something that could be done within the next 2 or 3 years. It would probably take 5 or 6 years to go through the whole process, get through the court challenges, and get it into the state air implementation plans. So it is one more reason for the Congress to take its job really seriously.
Thanks. Dale Scott. In the United States, there's a lot of research going on associated with clean coal gasification for electric generation. What is your company's view on this, and have you been moving forward on some of the new plants in that direction, similar to what's been happening in the Northeast?
What Energy Future Holdings Luminant, which is now the generating company, committed to do was to not build any more coal-fired power that wasn't carbon sequestration ready. And what we understood by that was we would use gasification, coal gasification, which creates a stream of more pure or high concentrate CO2. It turns out that is hugely expensive, much more so than it was. It's probably 2 or 3 times more expensive than it was when we made the commitment. And those companies that have elected to go forward with it, and I'm only aware of one in Indiana, are in regulated states where they can presumably pass the cost on to the ratepayer. which you cannot do in Texas. Texas has merchant power, deregulated power. So there's no current plan to build any more electric generating capacity, except there is an application for 2 nuclear reactors that the company has in. It already has 2. So I don't think it's a near-term issue for Luminant and Energy Future Holdings and Texas Utilities, but it will be down the road. I saw just the other day that Secretary Chu of the Energy Department of the United States has said that carbon sequestration should be ready to demonstrate in about 5 years. We'll have enough projects where we can judge its effectiveness, but it won't be commercially ready for another 10. And that is very disappointing because I know a lot of my environmental colleagues are just anti-coal. That is not a realistic position. The United States has too much of it. China has too much of it. India does. It's going to get used. We've got to figure out a way to make it innocuous. And carbon sequestration, I think, is the best hope to do that. But for the moment, it's one more of those technologies that I'm looking to the private sector to drive. There is $15 billion in the pending energy bill for development of carbon sequestration in the United States if that remains. So there's serious money that potentially is out there for that. Over here?
Good morning, Robert Wacklot. I was just wondering what role you might see for the regional climate regulatory frameworks like a WCI and RGGI, given the speed or lack of speed with Waxman-Markey, and sort of whether or not the EPA would jump in.
You mean the regional, the state regions?
Yeah, the state and provincial initiatives.
You know, I've always had the impression as a regulator that those would be like the dog that caught the car. They want to stand up and say they're going to regulate carbon dioxide. In some of the states, I don't think they had any idea how complex it was going to be. And Lord help us, if the law doesn't pass, they're going to have to do it. And there have been auctions that have been held, and this makes it harder because the auctions have begun for carbon entitlements, CO2 entitlements, pollution entitlements. The auctions have begun to generate money in Pennsylvania and other states. Well, all of a sudden, if something's generating money, it gets a lot more interesting and harder for the state under current economic circumstances to give up. My own view, though, is that, and Waxman-Markey does do this, it supersedes those programs. It wraps them in and gives us a national standard, even including California, which surprised Californians because California has always been allowed to go alone and farther on air pollution than the rest of the country because it had the most egregious problem in Los Angeles, and then in more recent years has done the most imaginative things to address those problems, particularly in electricity regulation. But I would assume that those will gradually pass away, that they will evolve into the national program and be superseded by it. That would be, in my view, the most efficient thing to do. Whether that's also true of renewable portfolio standards is another question. We have a requirement that anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20, now California's 33% of electrical power be generated by renewables. And this is partly, in California at least, a specific attack on oil sands and a way to try to keep oil sands energy out of the state. 33% is, I think it's by 2030, I'm not sure when. It's a very ambitious standard. I introduced the governor of California a few weeks ago at the 3rd anniversary of the climate bill in California, and he was asked the question, why did he not insist that all of the renewables that are used and to be required under California law be generated in the state of California? And he just looked at the questioner and said, we'd never get the permits. This is the governor of California. And I was startled at how he can sometimes be very direct, and he was. So Californians are quite happy to have the energy generated elsewhere, but for the moment at least, they don't want it to be too high in pollution. But I should say, in fairness, I don't mean to disparage California. California has, over the last 40 years, kept its energy use per capita constant, while the rest of the country has increased its use about 40%. And that's a direct consequence of decoupling in the regulatory system. So they figured out how to do it. It's a higher electricity cost state than other states. but it's been a great success in that area. And given that California is going to increase its population 40% in the next, I think, 25, 30 years, very important that they have succeeded in doing that. Another time we can talk about water in California and elsewhere, which is a hugely challenging issue. But hey, we got them all. We solved the climate problem this morning, right? Thank you all very much. I think we're done. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bill. Certainly, we all know today that you can't look at a newspaper or watch television without seeing references to the effects of climate and the need for new technology to deal with energy. Although most people in countries would agree that challenges exist, that there are many degrees of commitment on both sides of that. And certainly your discussion today, your talk was engaging. Your role and influence in moving government, corporations, and policy forward is truly forward-looking and remarkable. So thank you very much today for providing us with such your broad knowledge and the benefit of your experience. Your discussion was truly interesting, and thank you very much for attending today.